and therefore unaccountable in political terms. There was for Wilson and there is for Bush a very principled, perhaps we might even say messianic certainty, unencumbered by intellectual or religious doubt that leaves us somewhat breathless, either in admiration or in fear. In the hands of ideological zealots, such piety becomes a potent weapon, as likely to lead to tragedy and disaster as it might lead to the kingdom of God. On December 12th, 1960, the Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy gave a major speech before the Greater Houston Ministerial Association to address the significance of his Catholic faith in the face of lingering anti-Catholic feelings in many voters. It was, from a political point of view, a very successful speech, reassuring the audience of his commitment to the separation of church and state and stressing, I am not the Catholic candidate for president, I am the Democratic candidate for president who happens to be a Roman Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, he said, and the church does not speak for me. Now, central to Kennedy's speech was a very tight compartmentalization of faith, personal piety, and public responsibility. He called for a nation where no Catholic prelate would tell the president how to act and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote. And rhetorically, he concluded with what is perhaps intended to suggest his true creed and his allegiance to its primary sacred text. If I should win the election, he said, then I shall devote every effort of mind and spirit to fulfilling the oath of the presidency, for without reservation, I can solemnly swear that I will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God. Now, Kennedy's attempt to privatize religion was not so much a reaffirmation of the separation of church and state or the disentangling of religion and politics as it was an attempt to divide private piety from public responsibility, somehow putting them in two very separate arenas that a president could happen to inhabit at the same time without one influencing the other. It was as if he were saying, don't worry, there's nothing about my Catholic faith that will intrude into my public responsibility. Now, given the political needs of the day, that's probably a statement Kennedy needed to make. And given what we know about Kennedy, it may, in fact, represent what he actually thought about himself. This makes all the more ironic the near canonization of Jack Kennedy by a certain generation of Democrats. I vividly recall in Easton, Pennsylvania, Alphonse Sonny Morella's funeral home, where you would walk into the ante-room, and on one side was the Pope and the Virgin Mary, and on the other side, John and Jackie, the Holy Family, according to the Democratic Party. In 2006, 40 years after Kennedy's speech, another soon-to-be Democratic candidate for president, Barack Obama, gave another speech on the relation of personal piety and public responsibility. Much had changed. Evangelicals and more conservative Catholics had entered public life with the rise of the moral majority, the Christian Coalition, and family values leaders like Gary Bauer and James Dobson. The culture wars had raged with issues like school prayer, Roe v. Wade, the rights of homosexual persons, creationism, intelligent design, all captive to the political process and exploited eagerly in presidential politics. Perhaps most dramatically here in Ohio in 2004, where Bush's slim majority rested, at least in part, on wedge voters provoked to anxiety over the specter of gay marriage. Religion had roared back into presidential campaigns in highly partisan ways, making candidates' piety at least as important for many voters as their more traditional credentials. In the wake of all of this, Obama's speech proposed a new engagement of faith and public life. It's time, said Obama, to join a serious debate about how to reconcile faith with our modern pluralistic democracy. Obama was critical of conservatives, all too happy to remind evangelical Christians, he said, that Democrats allegedly disrespect their values and dislike their church, while suggesting to the rest of the country that religious Americans care only about issues like abortion and gay marriage, school prayer, and intelligent design. But his sharper critique actually went toward his own party, toward fellow Democrats, who at best, he said, try to avoid the conversation about religion and politics altogether, or at worst dismiss religion in the public square as inherently irrational and intolerant. Obama demonstrated his split with Kennedy most clearly when he said secularists are wrong when they ask believers to leave their religion at the door before entering into the public square. To say that men and women should not inject their personal morality into public policy debates, he said, is a practical absurdity. Now, one way to read Obama's speech in 2006 is to see it as a call for progressives to reacquaint themselves with the language of piety. But it's also a call to liberate piety and the church from captivity by the far right of the political spectrum. As one commentator describes the organizers of the Moral Majority and Christian Coalition, their primary goal was not religious, but political, to enlist evangelicals, many of whom had eschewed political activism altogether behind conservative Republican candidates. Indeed, one of their colleagues at the time described evangelicals, quote, as the greatest tract of virgin timber on the political landscape. Now, many believe that 2004 was the high water mark, if you will, of the marriage of evangelicals and the Republican Party. Sarah Palin's selection was in part an attempt, I think, to reignite the wars of religion that have benefited Republican candidates in recent elections. But the strategy doesn't seem to be gaining much traction beyond the far right base of the Republican Party. It does seem to be the case that the dominance of the so-called family values as political litmus tests has slipped in prominence. Even evangelicals today are calling themselves to a broader set of issues. Richard Cizik, for example, of the National Association of Evangelicals, rejected the notion posed by Gary Bauer and James Dobson that he was abandoning core evangelical values by embracing concern for the environment. Tell the parents of children, he said, who are mentally disabled because of mercury poisoning, tell them that the environment is not a sanctity of life issue. And there are many Catholics beginning to stand up to the threats of bishops refusing communion to candidates over the issue of abortion, recalling their church to a much broader moral agenda, the seamless robe concern for the sanctity of life championed by leaders like Cardinals Bernardin of Chicago and McCarrick of Washington. Now, I have no doubt that Senator Obama's reflections on the relationship of faith to public life are very sincere. They're consistent with his own religious biography described in his memoir, The Audacity of Hope. But there's also a political calculation here as well. His speech in 2006 was given at a conference organized by the socially progressive but evangelical leader Jim Wallace. Obama's friendships include the well-known evangelical author of The Purpose-Driven Life, Rick Warren, as well as so-called emergent church leaders like Brian McLaren. At a closed-door meeting of religious leaders in Chicago this past June, only a handful of us represented the old Protestant main line, and there were only a few Roman Catholics present. The largest number were a new generation of evangelical leaders like megachurch pastor Joel Hunter and Rich Cizik, who have broken from the old religious right in their embrace of other moral issues like global poverty, AIDS, the environment, education, and health care. Now, at the meeting in Chicago with Senator Obama, Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, played the guilt by association ploy, noting Obama's Muslim background, and then proceeded to relentlessly press the senator on the question, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life? Reverend Joseph Lowry, the old warhorse of the civil rights movement from Atlanta, was sitting next to me and objected to this line of questioning. Do we really need to know what our president thinks about this complex text from the Gospel of John? And the exchange raised for me a question, the central question of this particular talk today. What kind of piety is needed or wanted in today's public square